As a journalist who's done stuff with the BBC, I do not understand scientific ethics when you only report one side of an argument. And there are lots of scientists now, there's thousands of scientists that question HIV, thousands of scientists that question CO2 production, global warming. And it never gets mentioned. It's almost like we form the doctrine. It's like a religion. And so once you've got a religion, you're ridiculed. I've been told I must not question HIV because I'm putting off Africans taking chemotherapy, which is what antiretrovirals are. And I go, what? I'm causing their deaths?
You're a heretic.
Now, if a retrovirus doesn't cause cancer, then it doesn't cause AIDS. It's quite clearly wrong to take antiretrovirals. Now, I was describing retrovirals and how they're used in cellular communication. So antiretrovirals is also no. Why doesn't it say anti-HIV? Why antiretrovirals? It's because I've got a letter. I did some digging into this, so it's a bit off the topic, but I got the original papers from the lab from 1984. So I always go back to isolation experiments. And it turned out there'd been this enormous scientific fight in the United States in the 1990s between the French government and the American government over who'd found the HIV virus. And it got to a real battle. And the French won out. That's why in December last, a French scientist, Professor Montagneux, from the Past Institute, got the prize, and not the American scientist, for finding the virus that causes AIDS. The only problem is, the professor that got the prize, in his own paper, has said, I found a cellular culture. When they say you've got a virus in test tube, they mean a cellular culture. Because the virus, as I said, is short and lightweight. They don't actually send that to each other. They send the cell culture. And he said, I think it comes from, we're finding it, and he was using it to multiply. He was using fallopian tube, no, not fallopian tube, my brain's gone dead.
Medical cord cells?
Yeah, it's a cord, birth cord. And he's using that. Now, it happens that retroviruses are very rich in the placenta and is believed to help to protect the baby from the mother's immune system. So there's lots of retroviruses in the placenta. So they were growing it on this. That's not sick, that's not AIDS, it's a birth cord. Anyway, that's what he got. He said then, but what really did happen in that experiment was that Robert Gallo, the head of the working at the National Cancer Institute, which is part of the NIH in Washington, he'd been working for years and years to prove viruses cause cancer. And they'd failed. It was President Nixon's war on cancer. And it was a total scientific fiasco. Because they found the same viruses they found around cancer tumours, also in healthy people. And it couldn't be in healthy people that are non-cancerous and also in people with cancer. It didn't prove anything. So they're losing all their research grants. And they had to do something else, and at that time there was an outbreak in the gay community in the States of an immune disease, and he went, one of my cancer viruses might cause AIDS. Literally, that's how he did. So he had a virus that he called, cell culture, he called HTLV3. And he tested the purity for it, and his test was looking for an enzyme, which shorthand in biology is RT, but if anyone studies biology, it refers to transcriptase. And it's what our cells use to adjust our DNA. Right at the beginning of this talk, I was saying how cells can change RNA. They change DNA into RNA, and that makes RNA can be more flexible, and change it back to DNA, and they use an enzyme called RT, first transcriptase. So that's in every cell of our body. He looked for RT in his cell cultures. And every time he went to RT, he said, it's a retrovirus. Because retroviruses also happen to carry this enzyme. But he claimed it wasn't anything else but his virus. In retroviruses, not HIV, I mean, he's talking about the whole species, the whole type. Anyway, when he's claimed it, he isolated it in 48 people. All he did was find this enzyme. So he didn't isolate it. But it all failed. He couldn't do anything. And so it got to the beginning of 1984, and he instructed his chief scientist, Dr. Popovic, to take the French virus that they loaned to them for experimental purposes and rename it. And then he went off to London and France, and he boasted, we've got the AIDS virus. And what he had done, he had nicked the French virus sample and renamed it as his own. And he went round, he kind of, told the BBC, and he got ready, yes, we're going to have a big press conference back in the States. And they came back saying, and they had to race, because the Pasteur Institute had their cell culture, and the New York Times reported the French were ahead of the Americans. And a lot of prestige, and maybe a Nobel Award prize, if they got there first. Anyway, what I found was the draft of his scientific paper published in the Science Journal on the 4th of May 1984, a draft as it was when he got back from his sojourn in Europe. He'd already arranged for the Science Journal to publish the paper before he went away, before it was written. The experiment said to find HIV was conducted in his absence under the direction of Dr. Popovic, but he'd been so confident that he had actually got the Science Journal said these 3 associated papers, 4 papers in the Science Journal, which next to Nature is one of the top science papers of the world. So he'd already got it all arranged. He convinced them, but without having the research done. The research was being done while he was away. Dr. Popovic decided he was going to be honest. He had to do this fraud, and he had to protect himself. So when he typed up his paper, which I've now got, and the paper that was lying on Dr. Gallo's desk when he got back from Europe, he actually says on page 2, I'm using LAB, the French name, renamed as HTLB3, their name. The copy I've got has the printed alterations by hand of Dr. Gallo. It has a line through it, but it's still legible. And you find it in the back of my book, actually, so I've actually put a transcript, I've actually put a facsimile copy. And he writes in the margin, you're mad. He's owning up to fraud. Popovic needed his boss to do it, and not for him to do it. So he was the French pilot. And now, on that evidence is why a Nobel Prize was given to the French. So this copy I've got is authenticated, and it's the document that proved and gave the French the prize, Nobel Prize. So it proved it. Now I'm reading this document, and I turned over to the next page, and got the copy, and I found it got a lot more alterations that weren't mentioned in any report. And this was a matter of lawyers. The French got half the royalty rights eventually for the HIV test, which was a big earner for the American government, and for the French. And I found there were loads of changes by Robert Gallo to the paper. And I go, what? But unfortunately for Dr. Gallo, he left most of them legible. And on the very next page, and no one had reported this, it's crossed out, but it's still legible. Despite intensive research efforts, the causative agent of AIDS has not yet been identified. That is also deleted. Now, why did no one mention that? They give this paper to prove he gets a Nobel Prize. And he actually said, and I thought, maybe he doesn't speak English properly, or maybe he's got grammar mistakes. Maybe he means to say, before we did our research. So I go right through the paper, reading the typed version, and I look at the published version. There is no experiment in the entire paper designed to prove any virus causes AIDS, or any virus